A couple of bikers target the WR female submarine captain at a fishing supply store. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when two bikers, rough around the edges and hungry for trouble, rolled into a small fishing supply store tucked away in the corner of a quiet strip mall. The kind of store that smelled like saltwater and fresh catch, a place where local fishermen and women dropped by to restock on gear and share stories of the sea. But today, the regular humdrum of daily life was about to be interrupted. Out of nowhere, the two bikers burst through the door, the jangle of their leather jackets and the deep rumble of their engines still echoing in the air. Their boots scraped against the floor as they stepped inside, scanning the aisles with a sense of purpose. They weren't here to buy tackle or bait, they were here for something else. At first glance, they looked like nothing more than your typical rough and tumble duo, wearing leather vests and tattoos that seemed to tell the story of a life lived on the edge. But there was something different about today. Maybe it was the tension in their posture, the way they eyed the cashier, or the way they started whispering to each other, plotting something that didn't sit right. Behind the counter, however, stood someone who had no intention of being intimidated. Captain Sarah Grant, a woman with nerves of steel and a reputation that could rattle even the toughest of men. Captain Grant wasn't just any ordinary store clerk. She had once commanded a submarine, navigating deep into hostile waters, steering her crew through dangerous missions that most people could only read about in the news. To say she was capable would be an understatement. Yet despite her background, she wasn't here for the spotlight. She was just trying to enjoy some peace after years of military service, running the store and blending in with the quiet life she dreamed of. As the bikers strutted past the aisles of fishing gear, Captain Grant barely glanced up. She was used to all sorts of people coming through these doors, but these two? They carried an aura that made her uneasy. It wasn't long before they walked up to the counter, one of them cracking his knuckles as if preparing for a fight. "Got any special equipment for a couple of guys like us?" one of the bikers asked, his voice rough, like sandpaper against wood. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes calm but alert. "We've got what you need," she replied, her voice even, "but I don't think I've seen you around here before." "Just passing through," the other biker chimed in, his tone laced with a hint of mockery. "You always work here, lady?" Sarah narrowed her eyes, the tension rising. Something didn't feel right. These weren't just regular customers. It wasn't the questions they were asking or the way they looked at her. It was their body language, the way they circled around her like predators, waiting for the right moment to strike. They were sizing her up, and they thought she was an easy target. But they were wrong. There were stories she never told. Stories of the battles she fought, the decisions she made under pressure, and the quiet strength she carried with her every day. They didn't know who they were messing with. In her mind, she could already see the steps she'd need to take to defuse the situation before it escalated any further. The first biker, noticing her cool demeanor, leaned in closer, his breath smelling of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. "What's a pretty thing like you doing all the way out here, running a fishing store?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't you miss the action?" For a moment, Sarah stayed silent, not giving him the satisfaction of a response. But inside, her mind was racing. Was this just some random encounter? Or had they heard something about her, something that had put her in their sights? Either way, she wasn't going to be intimidated. With a casual motion, Sarah wiped her hands on the counter and straightened up. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said softly, locking eyes with the biker. The words hung in the air, charged with a quiet power that only someone who had survived the toughest of circumstances could exude. The bikers exchanged a quick glance, then laughed. "Oh, we know exactly who you are," the second one said, his voice mocking. "Just a lonely lady, hiding away from the world. But you don't get to run a store like this without making a few enemies." It was like a switch flipped. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she remained calm. Her eyes flicked toward the door behind the bikers. She was mentally mapping out her escape routes. They were too close for comfort now, and she could tell they weren't just here to chat. They wanted something, and if she wasn't careful, she might not walk out of this place the way she came in. She could feel the heat of the situation rising, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as she weighed her options. Should she keep her cool and diffuse the tension with words, Or was it time to remind these bikers that they targeted the wrong woman? Before she could decide, the biker's posture shifted, and it was clear they were here for a reason, and it wasn't a good one. Her fingers brushed the edge of a hidden compartment under the counter, where she kept a few things that could help her in tight spots. But before she could make her move, one of the bikers took another step forward, his tone now laced with something more dangerous. "Let's just say, we have a way of making people understand," he sneered. "And if you're not gonna be cooperative, well, things could get messy." The clock was ticking, and the pressure was mounting. Sarah could feel her training kicking in, every fiber of her being alert and ready. But the bikers weren't done yet. Just as she prepared to respond, the sound of a doorbell jingled, the sound of someone else entering the store. Would it be help, or would the situation spiral even further out of control? Stay tuned. The sound of the doorbell faded as the newcomer entered the store, but it didn't relieve the tension in the air. Sarah's mind raced as she watched the two bikers, who had shifted their attention toward the door, clearly unsure whether to deal with her or the new arrival. Her hand still rested on the counter, close enough to the hidden compartment where she kept an old revolver, a precaution she never thought she'd need to use. Her instincts told her that whatever happened next would be a turning point. The newcomer wasn't exactly who Sarah had expected. A tall, lanky man in a worn-out flannel shirt walked in, carrying a bag of live worms for fishing. He didn't seem to notice the standoff between Sarah and the two bikers right away. He muttered a greeting as he approached the counter, but when he saw the tension in the air, his pace slowed. His eyes flicked between the bikers and Sarah, sensing something wasn't right. The bikers, still sizing Sarah up, had noticed the shift in the atmosphere. One of them, Marco, the one with the scar above his eyebrow, suddenly shot a glare at the newcomer, as if the man's very presence had irritated him. Sarah wasn't sure if it was because of the interruption or something more personal. Either way, it made things more complicated. "Everything all right here?" the newcomer asked, his voice steady but cautious. Sarah barely moved, her gaze fixed on Marco and his partner, who were clearly not accustomed to being questioned. She could see the frustration building in their eyes. The last thing they wanted was someone else getting involved, but she knew she couldn't handle this alone much longer. The question was, could she trust this guy, or was he just another distraction in an already dangerous situation? The second biker, the one with a thick beard and tattooed knuckles, turned to the man, a grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, everything's fine. We're just talking business with the lady." The newcomer raised an eyebrow, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might back off, but to her surprise, he didn't. Instead, he leaned casually against the counter, as though he had all the time in the world. It was a small but telling move. He wasn't running from this. Sarah kept her eyes on the bikers, feeling the weight of their stares pressing down on her. It was clear now that they were looking for a reason to escalate things. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. She had no idea why they'd chosen her, why she'd become the target of their hostility. But she knew that with every passing second, the situation was slipping further out of her control. The bikers weren't just here to mess with her. They were here to get something. She could feel it. Something was off about them, about this whole situation. The last time she'd seen people like them, it was during a covert operation. Back then, she had the support of her crew and a full arsenal of weapons. Now she was alone in this small store with nothing but her wits and a few hidden tricks up her sleeve. "You know, it's not really smart to mess with people you don't know," Sarah said, her voice low and firm, trying to regain control. "You don't know who I am or what I've done. You're playing with fire." Marco stepped forward, the grin on his face widening. "You don't scare me, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "We've dealt with your kind before. You're nothing special." That hit a nerve. Sarah had faced more dangerous men than these two, but something about their cocky attitude was starting to wear on her. It reminded her of the arrogance she had seen from enemies before, a sign of people who underestimated the wrong person. Before she could respond, the newcomer spoke up again, his tone casual but with an edge that immediately caught everyone's attention. "Maybe she's right. Maybe you two should back off." There was a noticeable shift in the room. The bikers turned their attention to him, their eyes narrowing, sensing a challenge. Marco was the first to react, stepping toward the man with an almost predatory look on his face. "And who the hell are you supposed to be? You think you can tell us what to do?" Sarah could see that the newcomer wasn't intimidated. He had that quiet confidence about him, the kind that made people pause for a second. But Marco wasn't done. He moved closer, his hand twitching toward his waistband, and that's when Sarah's instincts screamed at her. Things were about to go sideways and fast. In one swift motion, she pushed the newcomer aside, her hand flying to the revolver she kept hidden beneath the counter. The sudden movement startled the bikers, and for a split second, the room went silent. Then, just as quickly, the tension snapped. Marco lunged towards Sarah, and the newcomer reacted faster than anyone had expected. There was a blur of movement, a flash of something sharp, and suddenly Marco was on the floor, clutching his side. The shock on his face was evident as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. His partner stood frozen, mouth agape, eyes darting between Sarah and the newcomer, who had now stepped back, calm as ever, his hand still hovering near his pocket. The store was quiet again, the only sound being Marco's heavy breathing as he struggled to rise. "What the hell did you do?" he snarled, looking up at Sarah, his expression one of disbelief. "I told you," Sarah said, her voice steady and cold. "You picked the wrong person." The newcomer simply nodded, a small, knowing smile crossing his lips. "Maybe next time, you'll think before you mess with someone like her." Marco's partner looked ready to bolt. He wasn't a fool, and it was clear he realized the situation was slipping further out of his control. He took one last glance at his injured companion, then turned and bolted for the door, muttering something under his breath. Marco groaned as he struggled to get to his feet, his face pale and filled with rage. "Get out of here, before you make it worse," Sarah said, her tone unwavering. Marco, breathing heavily, shot her one last furious look before limping toward the door. But just before he stepped outside, he stopped and turned to her. "This isn't over," he spat. And with that, he was gone, leaving Sarah and the newcomer alone in the store, the tension still hanging thick in the air. She turned to the man, eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The man smiled, his expression guarded yet amused. "Someone who's been watching your back, for now." Her heart raced, but she didn't let her guard down. She had a feeling this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. Sarah stood there, still gripping the counter, her pulse hammering in her ears. The biker's threat echoed in her mind, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of old instincts resurface, the kind she'd buried when she left the military, the kind that had kept her alive in situations far worse than this. But this was personal. The newcomer hadn't moved, still leaning casually against the counter as if nothing had happened. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something dark, like he knew exactly what would happen next. She took a deep breath, still scanning the room. The store, once peaceful and familiar, now felt like a ticking time bomb. "So," she said, finally breaking the silence, "who are you really? And what do you want?" The man looked at her, the slightest trace of a smile crossing his lips. "I'm someone who owes you one," he replied, his voice low. "Those bikers, Marco and his friend, they've been sniffing around here for a while. Didn't think they'd come after you, though." The weight of his words hit her hard. She'd noticed the bikers before, the way they lingered around the area, but she hadn't thought much of it. This small town was quiet, isolated. She'd thought she could find some peace here, away from everything. But it seemed like trouble had followed her. "Owes me one," she repeated, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" The man pushed off from the counter, his movements deliberate, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "I was on one of your missions," he said, watching her closely. "A few years back, when things went sideways. Well, let's just say I owe you for getting me out of a jam. You didn't even know I was there, but you saved my life. And now it's my turn to return the favor." Sarah froze. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. She hadn't known who he was, but now it clicked. His eyes, his voice. There was something about him she couldn't put her finger on before. He had been one of the guys in that mission, one of the crew she didn't even get to know well enough before it all went down. The mission that had ended her career. "I didn't know you were," Sarah started, but the words died in her throat. "Yeah, most people didn't," he interrupted, his tone soft but firm. "And I never plan on you finding out. But these bikers, Marco and his gang, they've been working for someone else. Someone big. They've been trying to track you down, maybe even finish what they started. And they'll keep coming. Not just for you, but for anyone in your circle." The weight of his revelation sank in, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had been trying to escape her past, but it was clear now that it wasn't going to let her go so easily. She could feel the years of careful detachment cracking under the pressure of what was happening. "Who are they working for?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man paused, as if weighing whether to tell her more. But then he stepped closer, his face shadowed by a seriousness she hadn't seen before. "That's the problem. I don't know yet, but I've been following the trail. And trust me, they're not done with you. They'll come back with more people, more power. If you want to stay safe, you need to figure out who's really pulling the strings." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in. Sarah's mind was racing. She had no desire to go back into the chaos of her former life, but it seemed like the chaos had found her anyway. She wasn't just dealing with a couple of bikers. She was up against something bigger, something dangerous. And now she had a choice to make: run or fight. Just then, the door swung open again, and this time, it wasn't the bikers. It was a police officer, Sergeant Lewis, a regular in the shop, his badge gleaming under the store lights. His eyes flicked between Sarah and the man standing next to her, the newcomer who now looked far too comfortable in a situation he didn't belong in. "You all right, Sarah?" he asked, his tone casual but alert. Sarah gave a nod, quickly glancing at the man beside her. "Yeah, just a little unexpected company." The officer didn't seem convinced. His gaze lingered on the newcomer, a silent assessment taking place. Finally, he sighed. "You sure that guy's not trouble?" Before Sarah could answer, the man stepped forward, offering his hand to the officer. "I'm just a friend. No trouble here." Sergeant Lewis didn't shake his hand, but he didn't make a move either. He simply nodded. "All right, but if you need backup, you know where to find me." With that, the officer turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Sarah was left alone again with the newcomer, the weight of the moment hanging heavy. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of determination and doubt. The man looked at her with a steady gaze, his expression unreadable. "Now we prepare. We don't know when they'll come, but we know they will. And when they do, we'll be ready." Sarah didn't have the luxury of ignoring the past anymore. Her world was spinning back into chaos, and there was no escaping it. But as she looked at the man, she realized something. She wasn't alone this time. Whoever was coming for her, she wasn't going to face it on her own. Not this time. They both turned to the door, the weight of their unspoken understanding hanging in the air. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. And as the door swung open, Sarah felt the resolve settle into her bones. No more running. No more hiding. It was time to fight.